Yeah, and that was the point that I was making because I tried to see things from the opposing worldview. And if by now you haven't guessed, I come from a biblical worldview with these
Mm-hmm.
concepts. But I wanted to put myself as someone who did not think biblically. How would they answer that question? Because I think the biggest argument against a belief in a God is that I can't see him.
Mm-hmm.
I can't experience him with my five senses. And so when I was asking the question, like, did that mathematical equation E equals mc squared exist before Einstein discovered it? And I don't think anyone who's a critical thinker would say no. It clearly always existed.
Right.
And I think you were hitting on this about the that philosophical question: if no one is around, does it make a sound? And yeah, the answer is yes, because someone perceives it. Now, it may not be you who perceives it.
Right.
The thing about the sun, clearly the sun rose, even if you didn't see it, but
Yeah.
someone else perceived it. And it's like we are so man-centered that just because we didn't perceive it means it didn't exist.
Right.
And just that mathematical truth, it kind of obliterates an empirical worldview or an exclusively empirical worldview, which says I only believe that which I can touch, see, smell, taste, and hear.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't do that with math.
No.
But you would never say that it doesn't exist. And so when I look up, just doing apologetics and just being very careful because everybody's always going to have questions, but I do want to attempt to answer questions, but realizing that I don't have all the answers because number one, I'm not God, and answering questions doesn't save a person. Yet at the same time, I do want to attempt, if I can, answer the question. And so just realizing that there are things that exist in this world that you can't experience empirically. And so math is one of those things. And before I got ahead of myself, Einstein did not develop this equation. He simply discovered it.
Right.
And so the other question that I kind of liken these math equations to buried treasure. So it's like if you find buried treasure,
Mm-hmm.
the question is, who put it there?
Right.
That's the
Yeah.
obvious question. Because clearly somebody dug a hole, put it in there. Me coming along just saying, oh, look at lucky me that I stumbled upon this. No, like somebody put it there.
Yeah.
And it's like we don't take that time to think, okay, Einstein, this is just one example of the mass energy equivalence formula, but he discovered that. But it's like, where did it come from?
Mm-hmm.
We don't stop and take a second thought and think, hey, we just kind of, because that formula, I think, just practically, it's used for food. I talk about the food that we eat. It breaks down, turns into stored chemical energy, or even solar energy, uses mass energy equivalence formula. And even nuclear things use it as well. So him discovering that formula has tremendous applications in our daily life. And it was a huge thing. So it's like, man, like how amazing is for Einstein to discover it, but he simply discovered it.
Right.
He didn't develop it.
And he changed the way mac and cheese would look in the microwave forever. Because even your molecular changes in the microwave,
Mm-hmm.
like you have a mathematical formula that your brain is working, even if it's not precise. Like you might guess, like that one time I told you guys I accidentally blew up hard-boiled eggs in the microwave. My equation was wrong.
You want to tell him what the equation was?
Well,
you left it in for how long?
Yeah, I just forgot to change it. It's just a little change from 100% to 50% the power. And, there was combustion. But
no one was
I
hurt.
learned my lesson, and I have done it correctly ever since then. But even, like, knowing the difference between, like, having X amount in your microwave versus, like, a larger amount versus a smaller amount, you know that it's not going to take as long to heat up the smaller portion. And so even in that, like, these discoveries, they seriously do change and affect everything that we do.
Yeah, and so the point that I try to get people to think is if these mathematical truths existed before man discovered them, like where did they come from and how? Because we've got to answer that question.
Right.
We've got to answer that question. So I kind of X man out that it clearly didn't come from man because it existed before man, and so I try to give an alternative solution. I try to say, okay, if I don't think biblically, how would I answer this question? Science possibly is what how these formulas came into be. And so I offer, two reasons why it can't be science. And the first thing that I say is that how can something that is visible, nature, bring forth that which is invisible, math? And then the second one that I offer, the second reason why I say that it can't be nature is I say if nature brought forth numbers, that would imply intelligence. And for the first one, I thought giving the example of a video game would just be a great example in how to explain that. And I'm not having, because my life is so busy, I don't have time to play video games anymore, but I'm somewhat heavy into video games, and I play sports video games, but even the video games where you're like in a real life setting, just watching the behind the scenes work and all the math that goes behind just creating all of those things so that they can create a world, a virtual reality world that you can go and play and do whatever you need to do. But it's like without math, that reality doesn't exist. So you can't say that preceded the math. It's the math that was used to create it. And it just kind of bugs me out because it's like we see this worked out just on a human scale with just video games, but yet we look at the formation of the universe and we're like, it just came into being.
Right, just poof.
Yeah, and it's like, okay. And so even if you want to go that route, it's like, would that not imply some sort of intelligence to nature? And the opposing view for those who share a biblical view is to denounce intelligent design. And I'm kind of curious, just even in a school setting, do the students that you have even think that critically into it? Or how does that work? Because clearly you have a biblical worldview and realizing, how far I can push it. So I'm always curious to see how that works out in just that setting.
Yeah, it's tough sometimes because in my job, I'm asked very personal questions all day. I have 87 students.
Wow.
And so when they're asking about evolution or, God comes up in our science class. I don't even bring him up. And so the kids will ask me something about, inertia, for instance. We did this today. So Newton's first law of motion. An object is going to stay still until another object or another force acts upon it, or an object is going to continue moving the direction it's going unless another force stops it. So we talked about the orbit a little bit, actually. So we talked about how the moon orbits the Earth and affects tides on the Earth. And we talked about how the Earth revolves around, orbits and revolves around the sun while the moon is still orbiting the Earth. And so one of my kids asked me today, Miss Casey, I'm trying to understand, how did the Earth start moving around the sun? And I'm like, yeah, this is I can't do a whole spiel on this, but I think you should process that more, and I think you should ask more people what they think about this and be willing to disagree and be friends. And I ask my kids all the time, is it okay for you to disagree strongly and still be friends with somebody? And it's amazing. I asked this about the election, actually, and half of my kids were like, yeah, of course, and then half of my kids were like, no. Like, oh, my heart broke, because they need to understand you can entertain an idea without accepting it. I think Einstein actually said that, I'm paraphrasing, but we should be able to let an idea run through our minds, process it, and make a decision about whether you agree or disagree and why not. And so I try to get my kids to just think, and I let them know if after they're done being my students, if they ask me personally again, I would love to have that conversation with them, because I would do that anyway with any human, but I try to be respectful of my position because it would be easy to take advantage of that and actually hurt families more than help them and minister to them. Even at my school, I want to represent my school well, and I want to represent God well. So there's a lot of prayer and discernment that comes along with that. It's a tricky position, but it's great to me because I didn't choose to be a science teacher. I would have told you that is the last thing I wanted to do. I actually wanted to teach math.
Really?
Just because I went to NC State and their methods courses are incredible for elementary education. And the idea is not to just, work with the literal number 3, the symbol like you even talked about in your book, but understand the abstract concept of it. And the way that I grew up learning it was not really about the abstract concept so much as it was about procedure and getting it done. And so when I went through college, they showed us, hey, you need to dig deeper. It's conceptual. And so math was my first pick. English was my second pick. Science, social studies, way at the bottom. Here I am. I teach science 4 days a week and social studies once a week. And I'm the only 5th grade teacher that does that at my school.
Wow.
But it's great because I feel like the more I study the sciences, the more I see God in that. And it is the neatest thing to think about. Even wordplay, like everything revolves around the sun in science. Well, in my belief, I believe everything revolves around the sun, which is Christ. So it's just amazing to see how like those little happenstances occur, but they're not accidental. They're never accidental. And I don't think math is accidental. I don't think science is accidental. And they're all connected. So to find those paths and work through them and find out that there are no walls to it, we're not going to find the end of it in this life. There's always more to learn and always more to discuss. And so if we're open-minded to discussing and even changing our positions, if we're open in that, I think it's a great opportunity we have.